If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the book. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Change, The World Before Agriculture. Part 1. Hunters, Gatherers, and the Quest to Survive. Long before humans ever planted their first seeds or built permanent homes, our ancestors lived in a world where survival depended entirely on reading nature's signs. These early people moved across vast landscapes in small groups of 20 to 30 individuals, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Each day began with the same fundamental question: where would they find their next meal? Picture a typical band of hunter-gatherers 40,000 years ago. The group consisted of extended families bound together by blood, marriage, and shared hardship. Every person had a role to play, from the youngest child learning to identify edible plants to the eldest grandmother whose memory of seasonal patterns could mean the difference between feast and famine. Men typically pursued large game animals like mammoth, deer, and wild cattle, while women gathered the bulk of the group's daily calories from plants, roots, berries, and small creatures. These people possessed an intimate knowledge of their environment that modern humans can barely comprehend. They could read animal tracks like a book, predict weather patterns from cloud formations, and identify hundreds of plant species by sight, smell, and taste. A single individual might know the exact timing of fruit ripening across dozens of different trees, the migration patterns of various animals, and the location of water sources across hundreds of miles of territory. Their tools reflected this deep understanding of materials and function. They crafted spear points from carefully selected stones, knowing which types of rock would hold the sharpest edge. They wove baskets from specific plant fibers, understanding exactly which materials would best preserve gathered foods. Fire became their greatest ally, used not just for warmth and cooking, but for managing landscapes by clearing underbrush and encouraging the growth of preferred plants. Social cooperation formed the backbone of survival. When hunters brought down a large animal, the entire group shared in the bounty, according to well-established customs. During lean times, everyone tightened their belts together. No individual could survive alone for long in this demanding world. The group's collective knowledge, passed down through stories, songs, and hands-on teaching, represented a library of survival wisdom accumulated over thousands of generations. These communities followed predictable seasonal rounds, moving between different resource zones as opportunities shifted throughout the year. Spring might find them in river valleys harvesting salmon runs and early shoots. Summer could bring them to highland meadows rich with berries and game. As autumn approached, they might gather at traditional nut groves, storing provisions for winter months spent in sheltered lowlands. This way of life persisted for tens of thousands of years, allowing humans to spread across every continent except Antarctica. Yet beneath this apparent stability, subtle changes were beginning to stir, changes that would eventually transform everything. Part 2. Shifting climates. The end of the last ice age. The world began to shake off its icy grip around 12,000 years ago. For countless centuries, massive sheets of ice had stretched across northern lands, trapping water and keeping temperatures bitter cold. These glaciers, some over a mile thick, had shaped the landscape and dictated where humans could live and what they could hunt. But something fundamental was changing. The Earth slowly tilted toward warmth, and the great ice sheets started their retreat. At first, the changes came gradually. Rivers of meltwater carved new valleys as glaciers pulled back from lands they had covered for thousands of years. The freed ground, dark and rich, emerged like a new world being born. As temperatures climbed, the very face of the Earth transformed. Where once only hardy grasses and scattered shrubs could survive, forests began to spread. Oak, birch, and pine trees pushed into territories that had been frozen wasteland. Grasslands expanded into rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers and edible plants. These changes meant everything for the people who had learned to live in the Ice Age world. The massive herds of woolly mammoths, cave bears, and giant elk that had sustained hunter-gatherer communities for generations began to struggle. Some creatures adapted to the warming world, but others could not keep pace with the rapid changes. Many of the great Ice Age animals simply disappeared, leaving behind only bones and the memories of the hunters who had depended on them. But the warming Earth also brought gifts. New plants flourished in the milder climate. Wild grains that had grown in scattered patches now spread across vast areas. Fruits and nuts became more abundant. Rivers and lakes, swollen with glacial meltwater, teemed with fish. The challenge for human communities was learning to take advantage of these new opportunities while mourning the loss of familiar resources. The hunter-gatherer bands found themselves in a world of both plenty and uncertainty. Traditional hunting grounds might now be underwater or covered in thick forest. Animals they had tracked for generations were gone, replaced by new species with different habits and migration patterns. Some communities thrived in this changing world, while others struggled to adapt their ancient ways of life. The warming climate also meant that previously inhospitable regions became livable. River valleys that had been too cold now offered rich environments for human settlement. Coastal areas once locked in ice became accessible hunting and fishing grounds. This expansion of livable space would prove crucial for what was to come. As the Ice Age ended, humans faced choices that would echo through history. They could continue their nomadic existence, following the remaining herds and seasonal resources, or they could begin to experiment with staying in one place longer, learning to manage the abundant new plant life around them. The stage was being set for a revolution that would change everything about how humans lived on Earth. Part 3. Population Pressure and Resource Rivalries. As the great ice sheets continued their retreat, something else was quietly changing across the warming Earth. Human communities that had survived the harsh glacial conditions were growing larger. Families were having more children who lived to adulthood. Groups that once numbered 20 or 30 people began swelling to 50, then 70, then more. This growth seemed like a blessing at first. More hands meant better hunting success and greater protection from predators. But as generations passed, these expanding bands began to bump into each other in ways their ancestors never had. The rich valleys and river bends that attracted one group also drew others. Hunting territories that had supported a small band for generations suddenly felt crowded when neighboring groups appeared on familiar trails. The mathematics of survival became increasingly difficult. A valley that had provided enough deer, wild plants, and fresh water for 30 people struggled to support twice that number. Favorite hunting spots became contested ground. Sacred gathering places where families had collected nuts and berries for countless seasons now required negotiation or avoidance when other bands arrived first. Archaeological sites from this period tell a troubling story. Human bones show signs of violent injury more frequently than in earlier times. Weapons become more sophisticated and deadly. Evidence suggests that some groups began building simple fortifications around their camps. The easy movement between territories that had characterized earlier human societies started to break down. Women gathering roots might find their traditional spots already stripped bare by another group. Hunters tracking wounded game discovered other bands had claimed the same animal. Water sources that had always been shared became points of tension when too many people needed the same spring during dry seasons. This pressure created a new kind of human experience. For the first time in their history, people began thinking seriously about boundaries and ownership. Certain families started claiming specific areas as their own. Leaders emerged who could negotiate disputes and organize group responses to territorial challenges. The stress of competition sparked something unexpected. Instead of simply following herds and collecting wild plants as their ancestors had done, some groups began paying closer attention to the patterns of nature around them. They noticed which plants grew where and when. They observed how some areas produced more food than others year after year. Out of necessity came experimentation. If wild resources were becoming unreliable due to competition, perhaps humans could find ways to make their food supply more predictable. Some groups began staying longer in places where useful plants grew abundantly. They started asking questions their ancestors never needed to consider. What if we helped these plants grow better? What if we could make more food appear in the places we control? The stage was set for humanity's greatest experiment. Population pressure had created problems that would require entirely new solutions. Part 4. Sparks of Curiosity. Early Experiments with Nature. When necessity sparked innovation, early humans began to notice patterns in the natural world that their ancestors had simply accepted. Around 12,000 years ago, small bands started paying closer attention to the plants they gathered most often. Wild wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent grew in predictable patches year after year. Wild rice flourished in certain marshy areas of China. Along the Nile, various grasses produced seeds that could sustain families through difficult seasons. Some observant individuals began to ask simple but revolutionary questions. Why did certain plants grow better in disturbed soil near their camps? What happened when seeds accidentally dropped during processing, sprouted in convenient locations? These accidents became experiments. People started deliberately scattering seeds in cleared areas close to their temporary settlements. The process was gradual and often accidental. Women gathering wild grains noticed that plants growing near fire pits or waste areas often produced larger, more abundant seeds. They began clearing small patches of ground and tossing seeds there, creating the world's first experimental gardens. These weren't farms yet, just attempts to encourage useful plants to grow where people could easily find them. Archaeological evidence tells the story through tools that changed over generations. Grinding stones became more sophisticated, designed to process increasingly tough seeds. Sickles appeared, crafted from flint blades set into wooden or bone handles, perfect for harvesting wild grains more efficiently. Ancient hearths show evidence of roasting and processing larger quantities of plant foods than ever before. Early animal management followed similar patterns of gradual experimentation. Young wild goats, sheep, and cattle occasionally became separated from their herds. Instead of immediately killing these animals for food, some groups began keeping them alive, feeding them scraps, and observing their behavior. These captive animals often proved easier to manage than their wild cousins, and they produced offspring that were even more manageable. Each region developed its own experimental approaches based on local resources. In the mountains of the Fertile Crescent, people focused on wild cereals and legumes. Along Chinese rivers, communities experimented with wild rice and millet. Near the Nile, early settlers worked with various native grasses and root vegetables. The experiments weren't always successful. Many attempts to grow wild plants in new locations failed completely. Some animals proved impossible to manage, but each failure taught valuable lessons that communities passed down through generations. Elders began sharing knowledge about which seeds produced the best results, which animals adapted most easily to human presence, and which techniques yielded the most reliable food supplies. These early experiments created a foundation of knowledge that would prove essential. Communities that learned to encourage useful plants and manage small numbers of animals gained significant advantages over groups that relied entirely on traditional hunting and gathering. Their food supplies became more predictable, allowing them to support slightly larger populations and remain in favorable locations for longer periods. The stage was now set for humanity's next great leap forward, as scattered experiments would soon evolve into systematic domestication practices. Part 5. The Turning Point. The Dawn of Domestication. The scattered experiments with wild plants and animals had taught early humans valuable lessons. But what happened next transformed these tentative steps into something far more profound. Around 10,000 years ago, in several regions across the globe, people began making a conscious decision to invest their entire lives in changing the very nature of the plants and animals around them. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent, women who had been collecting wild wheat for generations noticed something remarkable. The seeds that fell easily from the stalks were harder to gather, while the ones that clung tightly were easier to collect in large quantities. Without understanding genetics, these early farmers began selecting seeds from plants that held onto their grain. Generation after generation, they planted these seeds, and slowly the wheat began to change. The stalks grew stronger, the seeds larger, and the plants became dependent on human hands for survival. This process required extraordinary patience, A farmer planting seeds would not see the full benefits of her selection for decades. Mothers taught daughters which plants to choose, which seeds to save, and how to prepare the soil. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next, creating a living library of agricultural wisdom. The plants were changing, but so were the people. They had to stay in one place to tend their crops, watching over them through seasons of growth. Meanwhile, in river valleys across China, farmers were performing similar magic with wild rice. The tiny, scattered grains of their ancestors slowly transformed into the larger, more nutritious rice that could feed entire families. Each harvest brought new lessons about timing, water management, and seed selection. The relationship between humans and plants became a partnership built on mutual dependence. Animals presented different challenges and opportunities. Wild sheep and goats that wandered near human settlements offered both meat and milk, but only the calmest individuals could be kept close to people. Families began selecting the gentlest animals for breeding, gradually creating herds that looked and behaved differently from their wild cousins. Dogs, already companions to hunters, became guardians of these new flocks. The transformation was not uniform across the globe. In the mountains of Peru, people focused on potatoes and llamas. In Mexico, they worked with maize, beans, and squash. Each region developed its own relationship with domestication based on available resources and local needs. What remained constant was the fundamental shift in human thinking. People were no longer simply taking what nature provided. They were actively shaping the world around them. This systematic domestication created something unprecedented in human history. Communities could now support larger populations in smaller areas. Food storage became possible on a scale never before imagined. The predictable harvests allowed some people to specialize in activities other than food production, leading to new technologies, art, and social structures. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle that had sustained humanity for millennia was giving way to something entirely new. There was no going back. The domesticated plants and animals could not survive without human care, and humans were becoming equally dependent on their domesticated partners. This mutual dependence would soon reshape everything about how people lived, worked, and organized their societies. Chapter 2. Sowing New Worlds. The Agricultural Breakthrough. Part 1. First Fields. Cultivating the Fertile Crescent. Picture a small group of people standing at the edge of a grassy hillside in what we now call the Middle East, around 11,000 years ago. They hold handfuls of wild wheat seeds, but instead of eating them immediately, they do something different. They push the seeds into the soft earth with wooden sticks, cover them with soil, and wait. This simple act would change everything about how humans lived. The people of the Fertile Crescent had watched wild grasses grow for thousands of years. They knew where the best patches sprouted each spring and when the heavy seed heads were ready to harvest. But now they began to notice something important. The seeds that stayed attached to the plant longer were easier to collect than those that scattered in the wind. Without knowing it, they started choosing these plants to save and replant. Generation after generation, this careful selection created the first crops that humans could depend on. At Jericho, one of the world's first farming villages, archaeologists have found stone sickles with worn edges from cutting grain stalks. These tools show us how people learned to harvest their crops efficiently. They also discovered underground storage pits lined with stone where families kept their precious grain safe from rain and animals. For the first time in human history, people could save food for months ahead. The change wasn't easy. Wild wheat and barley required constant attention. People had to clear fields, plant at the right time, protect crops from hungry animals, and harvest before storms could destroy months of work. Women often took charge of plant care, while men hunted or built tools. Children learned to help with weeding and bird scaring. Everyone's life began to follow the rhythm of planting and harvest seasons. As crops became more reliable, something remarkable happened. Villages like Çatalhöyük grew to house thousands of people living in mud brick homes built right next to each other. Families could store enough grain to last through bad years, and some even had extra to trade with neighbors. This surplus meant not everyone had to spend their days finding food. Some people could focus on making better tools, crafting pottery, or creating beautiful objects. The settled life brought new challenges too. When crops failed, people couldn't simply move to better hunting grounds like their nomadic ancestors. They had to find ways to make their fields more productive or trade with distant communities. Weather became their master in ways their wandering ancestors never experienced. These first farmers couldn't have imagined they were starting a revolution that would spread across the globe. Their careful selection of seeds and patient tending of fields created the foundation for all human civilization that would follow. Part 2. Animals at the Hearth: Domestication and Dependence. As the first farmers learned to tend their fields, they discovered something remarkable happening at the edges of their settlements. Wild animals drawn by leftover grain and kitchen scraps began lingering near human dwellings. These creatures seemed less afraid of people than their wild cousins. Over countless generations, the bravest animals ventured closer, and the most patient humans began to see opportunity. Dogs came first, their wolf ancestors already social hunters who understood pack loyalty. Around cooking fires, the gentlest wolves found warmth and steady meals. Humans gained alert guards who barked at approaching strangers or dangerous predators. These early partnerships felt natural, built on mutual benefit rather than force. The process moved slowly, shaped by careful observation. Farmers noticed that some wild sheep grazed peacefully near their homes, while others bolted at the first human sight. They began protecting the calmer animals from predators, building simple pens from stones and thorny branches. The sheep found safety and regular food. Humans discovered a walking supply of wool, milk, and meat that required no hunting expeditions. Goats followed similar patterns, their curious nature making them natural companions to settled people. These hardy animals could eat plants that humans couldn't digest, turning weeds and scrub into valuable protein. Villages began to smell different, filled with the sounds and scents of animals rather than just human activity. The most dramatic changes came with cattle. These massive animals provided far more than food. Their strength could pull heavy loads, turning soil and moving materials that would exhaust human workers. A single ox could accomplish the work of many people, freeing farmers to tend larger fields or pursue other tasks. Village layouts transformed to accommodate these new residents. Houses clustered around central courtyards where animals could be watched and protected. Storage buildings held not just grain but hay for winter feeding. People developed new skills in animal care, learning to recognize illness, assist in difficult births, and breed for desired traits. These partnerships brought unexpected consequences. Animals and humans began sharing diseases in ways that hunter-gatherers never experienced. Close contact with livestock exposed people to new illnesses, but also built immunity that would prove crucial in later centuries. Village life became a delicate balance of managing both crops and creatures. The daily rhythm of settlement life revolved around animal needs as much as plant cycles. Morning began with milking, feeding, and releasing animals to pasture. Evening meant gathering flocks safely within village boundaries. Children grew up understanding animal behavior, learning responsibilities that connected them to the natural world in new ways. These domesticated animals became living wealth that could reproduce itself. Unlike tools or pottery, livestock multiplied over time, creating abundance that supported growing populations. The partnership between humans and animals established patterns of dependency that would reshape human society, creating the foundation for trade networks, specialized crafts, and complex communities that stretched far beyond the original farming villages. Part 3. Independent Inventions: Parallel Revolutions Worldwide. While villagers in the Fertile Crescent learned to live alongside their cattle and sheep, something remarkable was happening across the world. In places thousands of miles apart, other groups of people were making the same monumental discovery. They were learning to grow their own food. In the misty mountains of China, families began collecting wild rice seeds from marshy valleys. These weren't the same golden grains growing in Middle Eastern fields. Rice needed different conditions entirely. The Chinese farmers learned to flood their fields deliberately, creating perfect conditions for their chosen crop. They also discovered millet, a hardy grain that could survive in drier northern regions. These early farmers developed entirely different tools and techniques, yet they faced the same basic challenge: how to convince wild plants to grow where humans wanted them. Far across the Pacific Ocean, people in what we now call Mexico were conducting their own experiments. They found wild grass called teosinte, barely recognizable as the ancestor of modern corn. Through generations of careful selection, they transformed this modest plant into larger, more nutritious maize. Alongside corn, they cultivated squash and beans, discovering that these three crops grew better together than apart. They called this combination the Three Sisters, and it would feed civilizations for thousands of years. In Africa's river valleys, other farmers were working with sorghum, a grain perfectly adapted to hot, dry conditions. They also learned to grow yams, which stored energy underground and could survive harsh seasons. These African farmers understood their landscape intimately, knowing exactly when rains would come and which plants could thrive in different soils. Meanwhile, on the isolated island of New Guinea, people were cultivating bananas and taro root in completely different ways. They dug drainage channels through swampy areas, creating raised beds that kept their crops from drowning during heavy rains. Their agricultural methods looked nothing like farming anywhere else, yet they achieved the same goal. None of these groups knew about the others. They couldn't share techniques or learn from each other's mistakes, yet each developed agriculture independently, responding to similar pressures with remarkable creativity. Climate changes, growing populations, or diminishing wild resources pushed them toward the same solution: controlling their food supply rather than simply hunting and gathering it. The timing was strikingly similar too. Within a few thousand years of each other, all these separate agricultural revolutions began. Each group invented their own tools, developed their own crops, and created their own farming methods. The diversity was stunning, yet the underlying pattern remained consistent. This independent discovery of agriculture proves something profound about human nature. When faced with similar challenges, people across the world found similar solutions. The ability to cultivate food wasn't an accident or lucky discovery in one place. It was an inevitable response to changing conditions, demonstrating the adaptability that would soon transform scattered farming communities into the world's first true settlements. Part 4. Settlements emerge, from camps to villages. Once scattered groups learned to grow their own food, something remarkable happened. They stopped moving. For the first time in human history, people began to build homes meant to last. The earliest permanent shelters were simple but revolutionary. Families dug circular pits into the earth, then built walls of mud and stone around them. They covered these structures with timber and thatch, creating the world's first true houses. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ain Malaha shows these early dwellings clustered together, forming the beginnings of villages around 12,000 years ago. Living in one place changed everything about daily life. Women no longer carried their possessions on their backs as they followed herds across vast landscapes. Instead, they could accumulate tools, containers, and household goods. This stability sparked new inventions. Clay pottery appeared for the first time, allowing people to cook stews, store grain, and carry water more efficiently than ever before. The new villages buzzed with constant activity. Children played in the same spots where their grandparents had played. Adults specialized in different crafts, since they no longer spent every waking moment searching for food. Some became expert toolmakers, others skilled potters, and still others managed the growing stores of grain that accumulated in communal storage pits. These settlements offered something precious that nomadic life could not provide: security. Thick walls protected families from wild animals and harsh weather. Stored food meant surviving lean seasons without fear of starvation. The elderly, who might have been left behind during difficult migrations, now became valued keepers of knowledge and tradition. As villages grew larger, people needed new ways to organize themselves. They built special structures for community gatherings, often circular buildings larger than any single family dwelling. Here, villagers made important decisions together, shared news, and performed rituals that strengthened their bonds. These communal spaces became the beating heart of settled life. The transformation wasn't just physical but deeply social. Neighbors helped each other build homes, shared tools, and celebrated harvests together. Children grew up knowing everyone in their community. Marriage ties connected different families, creating networks of support that made survival more certain. Perhaps most importantly, permanent settlements became laboratories for human creativity. With time to experiment and space to store their creations, villagers developed new technologies at an unprecedented pace. They learned to make better tools, create beautiful decorations, and develop complex social customs that would be passed down through generations. These early villages were small by modern standards, often housing fewer than 200 people. Yet they represented a fundamental shift in human existence. People had chosen stability over mobility, community over independence. This choice would prove to have enormous consequences, as settled life created the conditions for even greater innovations that would soon reshape human civilization entirely. Part 5. Surpluses and Society: The Rise of Food Security. With their villages firmly established, these early settlers faced a remarkable new challenge. They had more food than they could eat immediately. For the first time in human history, communities could store grain for months, even years. Clay pots lined the walls of homes, filled with carefully preserved wheat and barley. Underground storage pits protected seeds from mice and moisture. Families who once worried daily about their next meal now planned harvests seasons in advance. This abundance changed everything. Village populations began to grow at rates never seen during nomadic times. Where once a band of 30 people might struggle to find enough food in harsh winters, agricultural communities could support hundreds. Children survived more often, adults lived longer, and women could bear more children without the constant stress of food scarcity. Villages that started with a few dozen families expanded into sprawling settlements within generations. The effects rippled through every aspect of daily life. Not everyone needed to spend their days planting and harvesting anymore. Some villagers could focus entirely on making better tools, crafting pottery, or building houses. Others became skilled at preserving meat, brewing beer, or creating beautiful decorations. This specialization meant that each person could become truly expert at their chosen work, leading to innovations that would have been impossible when everyone spent their time searching for food. Trade networks began to stretch between villages. Communities with surplus grain could exchange it for obsidian tools, shells, or other valuable items from distant places. These early merchants carried more than goods along mountain paths and river valleys. They spread ideas, techniques, and stories that connected isolated settlements into a growing web of human knowledge. Yet this new abundance created unexpected problems. Some families accumulated much more surplus than others, leading to the first clear divisions between rich and poor. Village leaders emerged to manage the complex decisions about storing, distributing, and protecting food supplies. These early authorities faced difficult choices during bad harvest years, decisions that could mean life or death for their communities. Weather became both friend and enemy in ways nomadic groups had never experienced. A single drought could destroy stored grain that represented months of labor. Floods could wash away entire harvests just before storage. Villages that had grown dependent on their fields found themselves vulnerable to natural disasters in completely new ways. The very security that surplus provided could vanish overnight, leaving large populations without the mobility that had once allowed their ancestors to simply move toward better hunting grounds. Despite these risks, communities continued to grow and prosper. The promise of reliable food proved stronger than the fear of crop failure. Each successful harvest reinforced their commitment to agricultural life, even as it bound them more tightly to the land they had chosen to call home. Chapter 3: Roots of Civilization: Societies Transformed. Part 1: Intensification and Innovation: Farming Technologies Advance. With their seeds safely stored and gardens flourishing, early farmers discovered that better tools could make their work far more productive. The simple digging stick that had served their ancestors began to give way to something revolutionary: the plow. This wooden blade, pulled by oxen or humans, could slice through soil much faster than any hand tool. Fields that once took weeks to prepare could now be ready in days. The transformation didn't stop there. Farmers noticed that crops grew better when water flowed steadily to their roots. In Mesopotamia, clever villagers began digging channels from rivers to their fields. These early irrigation systems allowed farming in places where rain alone wasn't enough. Soon, networks of canals stretched across entire valleys, carrying life-giving water to thousands of acres. As generations passed, farmers became better observers of nature. They noticed that some plants grew stronger and produced more food than others. By saving seeds from their best crops year after year, they slowly created new varieties. Wheat stalks grew taller and heavier. Corn kernels became plumper. This process, called selective breeding, turned wild grasses into the abundant crops we know today. Smart farmers also discovered the magic of crop rotation. Instead of planting the same crop in the same field every year, they learned to switch between different plants. Beans could restore nutrients that wheat had taken from the soil. This simple practice made fields more productive and kept them healthy longer. These advances spread rapidly between communities. Traders carried new tools and techniques along with their goods. A farming innovation that started in one valley might appear hundreds of miles away within a few years. Knowledge flowed as freely as goods along the growing trade routes. The results were dramatic. Fields produced more food than ever before. Villages that once struggled to feed a few dozen people could now support hundreds. With abundant harvests, not everyone needed to work in the fields. Some people specialized as toolmakers, crafting better plows and farming implements. Others became traders, carrying surplus grain to distant markets. But this progress came with a price. The intensive farming methods that fed growing populations also began changing the landscape itself. Forests were cleared for farmland. Rivers were diverted for irrigation. The rich diversity of wild plants and animals started giving way to human-selected crops and livestock. These technological leaps created a cycle of growth and complexity. More food supported larger populations, which demanded even better farming methods. As communities grew and prospered, they developed increasingly sophisticated ways to manage their resources and organize their societies. The stage was set for an even more dramatic transformation: the creation of trade networks that would bind these thriving villages together across vast distances. Part 2. Trade, Expansion, and the Web of Connections. The extra food produced by advanced farming techniques created something entirely new in human history: surplus. For the first time, entire families could eat well without everyone spending every daylight hour searching for food. This abundance changed everything about how people lived and worked together. Villages that once focused solely on survival began looking beyond their borders. They had pottery to spare, obsidian tools that neighboring communities coveted, and salt from dried lake beds that distant tribes desperately needed. What started as occasional exchanges between friendly neighbors gradually grew into something much more significant. The first traders were probably farmers who noticed that the clay near their village made better pots than what their neighbors could produce. They began carrying extra pottery to nearby settlements, returning with flint knives or woven baskets that their own community couldn't make as well. These simple swaps revealed an important truth: different regions had different strengths. Word spread quickly about which villages produced the finest goods. A settlement near obsidian deposits found themselves visited by traders from hundreds of miles away, all seeking the volcanic glass that made the sharpest cutting tools. Coastal communities discovered that inland tribes would trade valuable furs and amber for dried fish and seashells. Trade routes began forming along rivers and mountain passes. These weren't roads as we know them, but familiar paths that merchants traveled seasonally, carrying their goods in leather packs or on the backs of newly domesticated animals. At certain times of year, these routes buzzed with activity as traders moved between villages, creating the world's first economic networks. The exchange went far beyond simple goods. When a trader arrived from a distant village, they brought news, stories, and most importantly, new ideas. A farming technique that worked well in one region might solve problems in another. Religious beliefs, artistic styles, and even languages began blending as communities that had never directly communicated suddenly found themselves connected through these traveling merchants. Some villages became natural meeting points where multiple trade routes crossed. These locations grew rapidly as merchants stopped to rest, repair their goods, and conduct business. Local residents began specializing in services that traders needed: food preparation, tool repair, and secure storage for valuable items. The most successful trading centers started accumulating wealth and influence. They could afford to support craftsmen who made nothing but pottery or metalwork, creating even more desirable trade goods. These specialists pushed the boundaries of what was possible, developing new techniques and creating items of unprecedented quality. As trade networks expanded, they began connecting regions separated by vast distances. Shells from distant oceans appeared in mountain villages. Copper from far-off mines was shaped into tools in farming communities that had never seen the metal before. These connections were transforming isolated agricultural settlements into parts of a much larger, interconnected world. The web of trade relationships was creating something unprecedented: communities that depended on each other across enormous distances, setting the stage for the complex societies that would soon emerge. Part 3. Hierarchy and Specialization: New Social Orders. As trade networks flourished and connected distant communities, a quiet revolution was taking place within these settlements. The abundance of food and resources that flowed through these new connections meant something profound. Not everyone needed to spend their days growing crops or tending animals anymore. This freedom changed everything. In villages across the world, certain individuals began dedicating their lives to specific crafts. Some became master potters, shaping clay into vessels of remarkable beauty and utility. Others focused entirely on working stone, creating tools and weapons sharper and more durable than anything seen before. Still others discovered they had a gift for communication with the spiritual world, becoming the first priests and healers. These specialists didn't just create better products, they created value that could be traded, stored, and accumulated. A skilled metalworker could exchange a single bronze knife for enough grain to feed his family for weeks. This imbalance in the value of different types of work marked the beginning of something entirely new in human society: permanent inequality. As surplus wealth accumulated, those who controlled the most fertile lands and the most skilled workers began to rise above their neighbors. They built larger homes, wore finer clothes, and ate richer foods. These emerging elites discovered that their prosperity depended not just on having resources, but on protecting them. Warriors emerged as a distinct class, pledging their loyalty to those who could provide them with weapons, food, and status in return for protection. The leaders of these early communities faced new challenges that hunter-gatherers had never encountered. Who should receive how much grain from the communal stores? How should disputes over land boundaries be resolved? What punishment should befall someone who stole from the village warehouse? These questions demanded new forms of authority and decision-making. Religious leaders often stepped into these roles, claiming divine guidance in their judgments. They developed elaborate ceremonies around planting and harvest times, positioning themselves as essential intermediaries between the community and the forces that controlled their fate. Their proximity to the spiritual world gave them tremendous influence over daily decisions. The most successful communities were those that found ways to organize these different groups, farmers, craftsmen, warriors, and priests, into functioning systems. Leaders learned to balance competing interests, ensuring that each group received enough benefits to remain loyal, while extracting enough resources to maintain their own power. This new social architecture created stability and prosperity unlike anything humans had experienced. But it also introduced permanent divisions between people that would define civilizations for thousands of years to come. The stage was now set for these hierarchical societies to reshape not just how people worked and lived, but how they understood their place in the world and their relationships with one another. Part 4. The Family and Gender: Life in Early Villages. As agricultural communities solidified their new social structures, daily life within these early villages began to follow different patterns than humanity had ever known. The family became the basic building block of settled society, but farming changed what family meant and how it worked. Women found their lives transformed in complex ways. During hunting and gathering times, women had contributed equally to food gathering and often held significant influence in group decisions. But as farming took hold, women's roles became more centered around the home and children. They still worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, but their primary responsibility shifted to managing households and raising children. Men took control of the heavy work in the fields. They handled the plows, managed livestock, and made decisions about which crops to plant where. This division of labor seemed natural at the time, but it gradually gave men more control over the family's most valuable resource, land. When fathers passed away, they typically left their fields to their sons, creating a system where men owned the means of survival. Children's lives changed dramatically too. In nomadic groups, children learned by watching and helping with adult tasks as they moved from place to place. Now, settled children spent their days in one location, learning specific skills based on their gender. Boys learned farming techniques and animal care from their fathers. Girls learned household management, food preparation, and childcare from their mothers. The rhythm of family life now followed the seasons. Spring meant everyone worked together preparing fields and planting seeds. Summer required constant attention to growing crops. Autumn brought the entire family together for harvest, the most crucial time of year. Winter allowed for rest, repairs, and storytelling around the fire. Marriage patterns shifted as well. Families began arranging marriages to combine landholdings or strengthen alliances with neighboring villages. Love became less important than practical considerations. A good marriage could double a family's farmland or provide protection during conflicts. Evidence from ancient burial sites reveals these changing dynamics. Men were increasingly buried with farming tools and weapons, while women were laid to rest with cooking vessels and jewelry. Children's graves show toys and objects that reflect their expected adult roles: miniature plows for boys, small clay dolls for girls. The elderly gained new importance in settled communities. Their knowledge of farming techniques, weather patterns, and local conditions became invaluable. Grandparents helped raise children while parents worked in the fields, creating multi-generational households that pooled resources and shared responsibilities. These family structures created stability and continuity that allowed villages to grow and prosper. But they also established patterns of gender roles and inheritance that would persist for thousands of years. As populations continued to expand and resources became scarcer, these new family dynamics would face their greatest test yet. Part 5. The challenge of crowding, disease, conflict, and inequality. The greatest test arrived sooner than these early villagers could have imagined. As populations swelled within the confines of permanent settlements, the very success of agriculture began to create problems that hunter-gatherers had never faced. People who had once spread across vast landscapes now lived packed together in spaces barely larger than a few modern city blocks. Disease struck first and hardest. When families lived in small, scattered bands, a sick person might infect only a handful of others before the group moved on or the illness ran its course. But in villages where hundreds of people shared water sources, food storage areas, and living spaces, sickness spread like wildfire. Measles jumped from child to child in communal play areas. Smallpox traveled through extended families crowded into mud brick homes. Respiratory infections flourished in the smoky interiors, where families gathered around cooking fires during cold months. The problem grew worse as people began living alongside their animals. Pigs wallowed near homes, cattle grazed within village boundaries, and chickens pecked at scraps outside doorways. These close relationships between humans and animals created perfect conditions for diseases to jump from one species to another. Illnesses that had once affected only wild animals now found new hosts in settled communities. Food became another source of trouble. While farming produced more calories than hunting and gathering, it offered less variety. Entire communities now depended on just a few crops. When harvests failed or storage bins attracted pests, families faced malnutrition that made them vulnerable to disease. Children who had grown up on diverse wild foods now survived mainly on grain porridge, developing weaker bones and smaller statures than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Competition intensified as good land became scarce. Villages that had started as small farming experiments now housed hundreds of people who needed fresh fields every few years as soil became exhausted. When one community expanded into territory claimed by another, tensions erupted. Archaeological evidence shows the first organized violence of human history during this period. Fortified walls appeared around settlements. Mass graves contained bodies bearing wounds from stone axes and wooden spears. Water rights sparked particularly bitter disputes. Rivers and springs that had seemed abundant when only small bands occasionally visited them became precious resources when permanent communities relied on them daily. Villages fought over access to the best fishing spots, the most reliable water sources, and the fertile land along riverbanks. Within communities, inequality began to poison relationships that had once been based on sharing. Some families controlled better lands, larger grain stores, or more livestock. Others struggled with poor harvests or sick animals. The elderly wisdom keepers and successful farmers accumulated wealth and influence, while families hit by bad luck fell into dependence. These challenges forced communities to make difficult choices. Some villages developed new forms of cooperation, creating shared defense systems and mutual aid networks. Others split apart under the pressure, with families leaving to establish new settlements. Many communities turned to increasingly complex social rules and leadership structures to manage conflict and distribute resources. The solutions they chose would determine whether these early experiments in settled life would flourish or collapse, setting the stage for even more dramatic transformations to come. Chapter 4: The Spread of Change. Agriculture Goes Global. Part 1: From Heartland to Hinterland. Diffusion of Ideas and Crops. Once people learned to grow food in the great heartlands, the knowledge began to move. Like ripples in a pond, farming spread outward from its birthplaces in ways both simple and complex. The first carriers were the farmers themselves. As populations grew and good land became scarce, families packed their seeds and tools and moved to new territories. They brought wheat from the Middle East into Europe, carrying small pouches of grain that would transform entire continents. Rice farmers pushed south from China into Southeast Asia, while corn growers spread their precious kernels north and south through the Americas. Traders played an equally vital role. These early merchants didn't just exchange goods, they exchanged ideas. A trader might arrive in a village with strange new seeds, staying long enough to explain how to plant and tend them. Archaeological sites reveal this clearly. Pottery styles that originated in farming communities appear hundreds of miles away, often alongside new types of grain or farming tools. The evidence for this great spreading lies buried in the earth and hidden in our words. Linguists can trace how farming terms moved from one language to another, following the same paths as the farmers themselves. The word for cattle shares common roots across vast regions of Europe and Asia, marking the ancient routes that herders took. Archaeological digs reveal similar patterns, distinctive stone tools and pottery appearing in layers of earth that tell us when farmers first arrived in each new place. This movement wasn't always smooth or quick. Geographic barriers slowed the spread. Mountains, deserts, and oceans created natural boundaries that farmers had to find ways to cross. Climate posed another challenge. Crops that thrived in one region often failed in another, forcing farmers to adapt their techniques or abandon certain plants entirely. Yet the transformation was dramatic wherever farming took hold. Forests gave way to fields. Wild grasslands became pastures for domesticated animals. Permanent villages replaced temporary camps. The very bones of ancient humans tell this story. Farmers' skeletons show the wear patterns of people who spent their lives bent over crops, very different from the bone structure of hunter-gatherers. Local peoples didn't always welcome these changes. Some groups eagerly adopted the new ways, seeing the advantages of reliable food sources. Others resisted, preferring their traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle. Many found middle ground, incorporating some farming practices while maintaining their mobile ways of life. The linguistic evidence reveals fascinating details about this cultural mixing. Words for advanced farming techniques often come from the languages of the original farming peoples, while words for local plants and animals retain their older roots. This suggests a complex process of cultural blending rather than simple replacement. By around 5,000 years ago, farming communities dotted most of the world's suitable landscapes. What had begun as isolated experiments in a few river valleys had become humanity's dominant way of life. The stage was now set for farmers to face their next great challenge, adapting these new techniques to the incredible variety of environments across the globe. Part 2. Adapting to the environment. Innovations on every continent. As farming spread across the globe, each new environment demanded fresh solutions. The knowledge that traveled with migrating farmers was just the beginning. Real success meant adapting these basic ideas to local conditions that varied dramatically from the original river valleys where agriculture first took root. In the steep mountain slopes of the Andes, early farmers faced a unique challenge. Rain would wash away their precious soil, and the harsh altitude made growing difficult. Their response was brilliant in its simplicity. They carved terraces into the mountainsides, creating flat platforms that caught rainwater and prevented erosion. These stone-walled steps transformed hostile slopes into productive farmland. The same principle appeared independently in other mountain regions, from China's rice terraces to the Mediterranean hillsides. Forest dwellers developed their own approach. In tropical regions from South America to Southeast Asia, farmers practiced what we now call slash-and-burn agriculture. They would clear small patches of forest, burn the vegetation to create nutrient-rich ash, and plant crops in the fertile soil. After a few years, they would move to a new patch, allowing the forest to reclaim the old one. This cycle worked perfectly with the forest's natural rhythms, providing food without destroying the ecosystem. In wetland areas, farmers created raised fields. They dug channels and piled the mud onto higher ground, creating artificial islands for planting. These elevated plots stayed dry during floods while the channels provided fish and water for irrigation. The Maya perfected this technique in their swamplands, creating complex networks that fed thousands of people. Desert regions demanded different innovations. Farmers learned to capture and channel scarce rainfall, building elaborate systems of underground canals and surface ditches. They discovered which plants could survive with minimal water and developed timing systems based on rare but predictable rains. Each region also domesticated its own local species. While wheat and barley spread from the Middle East, people everywhere began taming their local plants and animals. Andean farmers domesticated potatoes and llamas. African farmers developed sorghum and millet suited to their climate. Asian farmers created rice varieties that thrived in flooded fields. This process required constant experimentation. Farmers had to observe their environment closely, understanding seasonal changes, soil types, and local weather patterns. They tested new techniques, kept what worked, and abandoned what failed. Knowledge passed from generation to generation, with each adding their own improvements. The most successful communities combined imported knowledge with local innovation. They took the basic concept of farming but adapted it completely to their specific conditions. This flexibility allowed agriculture to succeed in environments that seemed impossible for farming. These adaptations created the foundation for civilization's next phase. Surplus food from these diverse farming systems would soon support growing populations, leading to more complex societies and the inevitable conflicts that arose when different groups competed for the best agricultural lands. Part 3. Cultural exchange and competition. The first exchange happened by accident. A group of farmers from the river valley met traders carrying seeds from distant mountains. Both groups needed what the other had. The valley people had surplus grain, while the mountain folk brought hardy root vegetables that could survive harsh winters. This simple trade changed everything. Word spread quickly about these new possibilities. Soon, farming communities began seeking each other out deliberately. They discovered that sharing knowledge helped everyone survive. A technique for storing grain that worked in dry regions could be adapted for wet climates. Religious ceremonies that celebrated harvests in one area inspired similar rituals elsewhere. Young people married into neighboring groups, carrying agricultural secrets with them like wedding gifts. But this cooperation came with a price. As populations grew and farming communities expanded, they bumped into each other more often. The best land became scarce. Rivers that could irrigate multiple settlements suddenly seemed too small. Fertile valleys that once seemed endless now had clear boundaries where one group's territory ended and another's began. Competition emerged gradually. At first, disputes were settled through negotiation. Community leaders would meet to divide grazing rights or establish fishing boundaries. They created the first formal agreements between settled peoples, learning to compromise rather than fight. These peaceful solutions worked when resources were abundant. However, when drought struck or crops failed, desperation changed everything. Communities that had shared knowledge peacefully now eyed each other's stored grain with envy. The same trade routes that once carried helpful innovations also became pathways for raids. Groups began fortifying their settlements, building walls around their most valuable fields and storage areas. Warfare became organized for the first time in human history. Unlike the small skirmishes of hunter-gatherer bands, agricultural societies could support dedicated warriors. They had enough surplus food to feed people whose only job was fighting. They also had more to protect: permanent homes, stored crops, and domesticated animals that could not simply be moved when danger approached. These conflicts spread agricultural techniques as quickly as peaceful trade had. Conquered peoples learned new farming methods from their victors. Victorious groups adopted useful practices from those they defeated. Even enemy communities borrowed military innovations from each other, creating an arms race that pushed both sides to develop better weapons and defensive strategies. The most successful societies learned to balance competition with cooperation. They formed alliances with distant groups while competing with immediate neighbors. They traded knowledge freely, but guarded their best agricultural secrets. They celebrated shared cultural practices while maintaining distinct identities that could justify conflict when necessary. This delicate balance between exchange and competition created the template for all future civilizations. The patterns established during these early interactions, diplomacy, trade, warfare, and cultural borrowing, would shape human societies for thousands of years to come, setting the stage for the monumental construction projects that would soon mark the landscape. Part 4. Rise of Monumental Sites: Stonehenge, Jericho, and Beyond. The walls of Jericho rose from the desert floor like a giant's work, each stone placed by human hands around 9000 BCE. These weren't just barriers against enemies. They represented something entirely new in human history: the ability of settled people to dream big and make those dreams real through collective effort. Inside the ancient city, families had moved beyond simply growing enough food to survive. Their fields produced surplus grain that fed not just farmers, but also the workers who quarried stone, mixed mortar, and hauled massive blocks into place. For the first time, entire communities could dedicate months to projects that served no immediate survival need. The walls of Jericho stood as proof that agriculture had given birth to organized society. Thousands of miles away, on the windswept plains of Britain, another monument was taking shape. Stonehenge began as a simple earthen circle around 3100 BCE, but over centuries it transformed into something extraordinary. Massive stones, some weighing as much as 50 tons, were dragged from quarries hundreds of miles away. Families from scattered farming villages gathered for the construction, bringing their strongest oxen and their most skilled workers. The effort required precise planning and unwavering cooperation. Someone had to organize the transport of stones across rivers and hills. Others calculated the exact positions where each massive trilithon would stand. The project demanded surplus food to feed hundreds of workers, specialized tools that took months to craft, and a shared vision that could inspire generations to continue the work their ancestors had started. Even more remarkable was Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, where hunter-gatherers had begun constructing elaborate stone circles around 9600 BCE, before agriculture had fully taken hold. These massive T-shaped pillars, carved with intricate animal reliefs, required the coordination of dozens of groups across the region. The site suggests that the drive to create monumental architecture might have actually encouraged the development of farming, as feeding large construction crews demanded reliable food production. These monuments served purposes that went far beyond their physical presence. They became focal points for religious ceremonies that bound scattered communities together. At seasonal gatherings, thousands of people would converge on these sites, sharing not just worship but also trade goods, marriage arrangements, and knowledge. The monuments transformed isolated farming villages into participants in something larger than themselves. The construction of these sites revealed the true power of agricultural surplus. Extra food meant some people could become full-time specialists: architects, priests, craftsmen, and laborers. These specialists developed new technologies, from advanced stoneworking techniques to sophisticated astronomical observations embedded in the monument's alignments. As these great stones rose toward the sky, they announced to the world that humanity had crossed a threshold. The age of simply surviving had ended. The age of building civilizations had begun. Part 5. Resistance and Persistence, the Last Hunter-Gatherers. As massive stone circles rose from the earth and farming villages grew into bustling towns, not everyone welcomed this new way of life. Across the world, countless groups of hunter-gatherers watched the advancing tide of agriculture with mixed feelings. Some saw opportunity, others saw threat. Most simply tried to survive. The Bushmen of southern Africa faced this choice when Bantu farmers began moving into their ancient hunting grounds. For thousands of years, these skilled foragers had thrived in harsh landscapes that seemed impossible to farm. They knew every water source, every edible plant, every animal track across vast territories. When farmers arrived with cattle and crops, the Bushmen didn't simply vanish. Some groups retreated deeper into the Kalahari Desert, where their intimate knowledge of the land still gave them advantages over newcomers. Other Bushmen chose a different path. They began trading with farmers, exchanging honey, medicinal plants, and hunting services for metal tools and grain. Some even learned basic farming techniques while maintaining their nomadic lifestyle. They created a hybrid existence, neither fully hunter-gatherer nor fully agricultural, but something entirely their own. In Australia, Aboriginal groups developed similar strategies when farmers later arrived. The Yolngu people of northern Australia incorporated some agricultural knowledge while preserving their complex seasonal movement patterns. They understood that their traditional burning practices actually improved the land for both wild foods and the crops that newcomers tried to grow. The Pacific Northwest peoples of North America showed another approach. Groups like the Tlingit and Haida already lived in such abundance from fishing and foraging that agriculture seemed unnecessary. When agricultural ideas reached them, they selectively adopted useful techniques while rejecting wholesale lifestyle changes. They enhanced their existing food storage methods and continued their sophisticated seasonal rounds between coastal and inland resources. But adaptation came with costs. As farming populations grew and claimed more territory, foraging groups found their traditional hunting grounds shrinking. Rivers became property boundaries. Sacred groves became crop fields. Animal migration routes were blocked by settlements and fences. Some groups fought back. Archaeological evidence from many regions shows conflicts between expanding farmers and established foraging peoples. But these were often unequal contests. Farmers had larger, more settled populations, and increasingly sophisticated weapons and defenses. Yet hunter-gatherers possessed crucial advantages. They moved quickly through landscapes that farmers couldn't easily navigate. They survived in environments where crops failed. Their knowledge of local conditions often proved invaluable during droughts, floods, or other disasters that devastated agricultural communities. Many foraging societies found ways to coexist with farmers for centuries. They occupied different ecological niches, trading surplus goods and specialized knowledge. The farmers needed the hunters' intimate understanding of local wildlife and weather patterns. The hunters needed the farmers' metal tools and surplus grain during difficult seasons. This complex dance between old and new ways of life created a patchwork world where multiple survival strategies coexisted. The transition to agriculture wasn't a simple replacement of one lifestyle with another. Instead, it generated countless experiments in human adaptation, each group finding unique solutions to the challenge of living in a rapidly changing world. Chapter 5. Harvest of Civilization, Long-Term Consequences. Part 1. Urban Revolution, the Birth of Cities and States. The scattered farming villages of Mesopotamia grew crowded as centuries passed. Families multiplied, and the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers could barely contain all the people. Something had to change. Around 3500 BCE, these swelling communities began clustering together. forming the world's first true cities. Uruk emerged as a giant among these early settlements. Its mud brick walls enclosed over 50,000 people, a number that would have seemed impossible just generations before. The city sprawled across the landscape like a living organism, with narrow streets winding between towering temples and bustling marketplaces. At its heart stood the Great Ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid that dominated the skyline and declared to all who saw it that this was a place of power. This transformation happened because agriculture had created something remarkable: surplus. Farmers now grew more food than their families needed. This extra grain freed some people from the daily task of finding their next meal. They became craftsmen, priests, soldiers, and administrators. A baker could spend his entire day making bread for others. A metalworker could forge tools and weapons. A scribe could keep track of grain stores and trade agreements. The city needed someone to organize this complexity. Kings emerged from the chaos, claiming divine approval for their rule. They built palaces, commanded armies, and controlled the distribution of resources. In Egypt, pharaohs declared themselves living gods, constructing massive pyramids as eternal homes. Along the Indus River, unknown rulers governed cities with remarkably advanced sewage systems and standardized weights. In China, early dynasties claimed the mandate of heaven gave them the right to rule all under the sky. These urban centers became magnets for surrounding populations. People walked for days to reach places like Memphis in Egypt or Harappa in the Indus Valley. They came seeking opportunity, protection, or simply to witness the wonders of city life. The concentration of people created new problems that required new solutions. How do you feed 50,000 people daily? How do you maintain order among strangers? How do you organize massive construction projects? The answers shaped human civilization forever. Cities developed complex hierarchies with kings at the top, priests and nobles below them, merchants and craftsmen in the middle, and farmers and slaves at the bottom. They created systems of taxation, military service, and public works. Trade networks stretched across continents as cities exchanged goods, ideas, and technologies. Competition between these urban centers sparked innovation and conflict. Cities built walls for protection and armies for conquest. They developed new weapons, better organization, and more efficient administration. Success bred imitation as neighboring regions copied the urban model. The scale of human cooperation had expanded beyond anything previously imaginable. Thousands of people now worked together toward common goals, whether building monuments, defending territory, or conducting trade. Yet this cooperation came with a price: the loss of individual freedom and the creation of stark inequalities that would define human societies for millennia to come. Part 2, Religion and Government, New Forms of Power. As cities grew larger and more complex, their rulers faced an overwhelming challenge: how to manage thousands of people, track vast amounts of goods, and maintain order across sprawling settlements. The human mind could no longer hold all the information needed to run these new societies. Memory alone was not enough. The solution emerged in the temples and palaces of ancient Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE. Sumerian scribes began making marks on clay tablets, creating the world's first writing system. These wedge-shaped marks, called cuneiform, started as simple pictures representing objects: a sheep, a jar of oil, a measure of grain. But soon the symbols evolved to capture more complex ideas, sounds, and abstract concepts. Writing transformed everything. For the first time in human history, information could outlive the person who created it. Laws could be recorded exactly as written, preventing disputes about what the king had actually decreed. Tax records kept precise accounts of who owed what to whom. Trade agreements could be copied and stored safely. Knowledge accumulated across generations instead of dying with each elder. Egypt developed its own system of hieroglyphs around the same time, while the Indus Valley created an intricate script that archaeologists still struggle to decode. Each civilization found its own path to preserving knowledge, but the impact was universal. Writing gave rulers unprecedented power to control their subjects. Religious leaders quickly grasped writing's potential. Priests had always served as intermediaries between humans and gods, but now they could claim exclusive access to divine wisdom recorded in sacred texts. Temple scribes became the keepers of cosmic knowledge, recording prayers, rituals, and religious laws that only they could read. The ability to interpret these holy writings elevated priests above ordinary citizens, creating a new form of spiritual authority. Governments discovered that written laws carried more weight than spoken commands. When Hammurabi carved his famous law code onto stone pillars around 1750 BCE, he created something revolutionary: rules that applied equally to everyone, recorded permanently for all to see. Citizens could no longer claim ignorance of the law, and judges could not easily change punishments based on personal whims. These three innovations, writing, organized religion, and formal government, became intertwined in ways that shaped civilization. Kings claimed divine approval for their authority, commissioning scribes to record their God-given right to rule. Priests validated royal power in exchange for protection and resources. Written laws reinforced both religious teachings and political control. The consequences rippled through society. A small educated class emerged who could read and write, setting themselves apart from illiterate farmers and craftsmen. Knowledge became a source of power, creating new forms of inequality. Those who controlled information controlled others. Yet these same tools that concentrated power also preserved human achievements. Stories, laws, and discoveries could now survive disasters, wars, and the death of their creators. Civilization had found a way to build upon its past rather than constantly starting over, setting the stage for even greater transformations to come. Part 3. Ecological Footprints. Humans reshaped the planet. The moment humans learned to grow their own food, they began changing the world in ways they never imagined. What started as small plots of cleared land gradually transformed entire landscapes. The changes happened slowly at first, almost invisibly, but over generations they reshaped the planet itself. Forests that had stood for thousands of years fell to make room for fields. Early farmers needed wood for houses, tools, and fuel, but they also needed open space where sunlight could reach their crops. Tree by tree, acre by acre, vast woodlands disappeared. Archaeological evidence shows how quickly this transformation occurred. Pollen records from lake beds reveal the moment when tree pollen suddenly drops and grass pollen increases, marking the arrival of agriculture in region after region. Rivers became tools in human hands. Farmers dug channels to carry water to their fields, creating the world's first irrigation systems. They built dams and levees to control flooding. The Mesopotamians turned the wild Tigris and Euphrates into a network of canals that fed their cities. In Egypt, the Nile's annual floods were captured and directed across the valley floor. These engineering marvels allowed civilization to flourish, but they also changed how rivers flowed and where they went. The soil itself bore the burden of constant cultivation. Wild lands naturally renewed their fertility through cycles of growth and decay, but farmed fields grew the same crops year after year. The rich black earth that had taken centuries to form began to thin and wash away. Some farmers learned to let fields rest or to rotate different crops, but others simply moved on when their land wore out, clearing new areas to replace the exhausted ones. Animals that had roamed freely found their paths blocked by fences and fields. Wetlands disappeared as farmers drained them. Grasslands became farmland. The very shape of the landscape changed as humans leveled hills, filled valleys, and straightened the meandering courses of streams. Some communities faced the consequences of their environmental changes quickly and dramatically. When rains failed or rivers shifted course, entire cities could be abandoned overnight. The Indus Valley civilization may have collapsed when the rivers that fed their fields changed direction. Other societies learned to adapt, developing new techniques to preserve their soil and manage their water more carefully. Yet these early farmers had little choice but to continue reshaping their world. Each new mouth to feed required more land, more water, more resources. The tools they had created to survive became the forces that drove further change. What had begun as small human communities living within nature's limits had become something entirely new, a species capable of altering the planet itself. These ancient choices established patterns that would echo through history. The relationship between humans and their environment had fundamentally changed, setting the stage for both the magnificent achievements and the profound challenges that would define civilization itself. Part 4. The Double-Edged Sword. Blessings and Burdens. The promise of settled life came with a price that early humans could never have imagined. As communities grew larger and more successful, the very achievements that agriculture made possible began to create new problems. The abundance that once seemed like pure blessing revealed its darker companion, inequality. In the earliest farming villages, everyone had worked together, sharing tools, labor, and harvests. But as settlements expanded and food surpluses grew, some families began to accumulate more than others. Those who controlled the best land or had the largest storage facilities found themselves with power over their neighbors. The social fabric that had held small groups together started to stretch and tear under new pressures. The human body paid its own toll for this new way of life. Hunter-gatherers had been tall, strong, and healthy, with varied diets that included dozens of different plants and animals. Early farmers, by contrast, relied heavily on just a few crops. Their skeletons tell a story of malnutrition, with shorter statures and bones marked by disease. Tooth decay became common as grain-based diets took hold. The variety that had once protected human health disappeared. Disease struck these growing communities with devastating force. When people lived in small, scattered groups, illness could not spread far. But packed together in permanent settlements, surrounded by domesticated animals and their waste, early farmers created perfect conditions for epidemics. Measles, smallpox, and other diseases jumped from animals to humans, then raced through dense populations with deadly efficiency. The commitment to farming trapped people in cycles they could not escape. When crops failed due to drought, flood, or disease, entire communities faced starvation. Hunter-gatherers could simply move to areas with better resources, but farmers had invested too much in their fields and homes to abandon them easily. They had to stay and endure whatever hardships came. Violence became more organized and brutal. Small groups of hunter-gatherers had conflicts, but settled farmers had something worth fighting for: stored grain, fertile land, and permanent structures. War took on new meaning when there were resources to raid and territory to defend. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of fortifications, mass graves, and weapons designed specifically for human combat. Yet for all these costs, the advantages of agriculture proved irresistible. Despite shorter lives and harder work, farming populations grew rapidly. They could support more children, accumulate knowledge across generations, and create objects of lasting beauty. Art, music, and complex social rituals flourished in ways impossible for nomadic groups. The choice between security and freedom had been made, though few at the time understood the full consequences. Agriculture had created the foundation for everything that would follow: cities, writing, governments, and civilizations. But it had also established patterns of inequality, environmental degradation, and social conflict that would echo through human history. The seeds of both humanity's greatest achievements and its most persistent problems had been planted in those first fertile fields. Part 5. Echoes Through Time. The Legacy of the Neolithic Revolution. The choices made in those first fertile fields continue to shape our world today. Modern societies still grapple with the fundamental tensions that emerged when humans first chose farming over hunting and gathering. The concepts of private property, social hierarchy, and permanent settlement that began in the Neolithic era remain central to how we organize our lives. Walk through any modern city, and you see the direct descendants of those first agricultural villages. The skyscrapers reaching toward the heavens echo the ancient impulse to build monuments that declared human mastery over nature. The busy markets filled with specialized goods reflect the same division of labor that allowed some people to become potters, while others focused on growing grain. The government buildings housing complex bureaucracies trace their origins to those first chiefs who needed to manage surplus grain and settle disputes over land. Our relationship with the environment still follows patterns established 10,000 years ago. We continue to reshape landscapes to serve human needs, draining wetlands for farmland and diverting rivers for irrigation, just as our ancestors did. Climate change and soil depletion represent the same basic challenge that Neolithic farmers faced: how to sustain growing populations without destroying the natural systems that support us. The social problems that plague modern society also have deep agricultural roots. Income inequality mirrors the gap between landowners and laborers that first appeared in farming communities. The tension between individual ambitions and collective needs reflects the same challenges that early villages faced when deciding how to share resources and divide responsibilities. Yet agriculture also gave us the tools to address these challenges. The ability to support large populations created the workforce needed for great projects like hospitals, schools, and research centers. The surplus that allowed some people to specialize in non-food production gave us artists, scientists, and philosophers who could imagine better ways of living. Perhaps most importantly, the Neolithic Revolution demonstrated humanity's extraordinary adaptability. When climate changes and population pressures made hunting and gathering unsustainable, our ancestors found new ways to survive and thrive. They transformed themselves from wandering bands into settled communities, developing new technologies and social systems as needed. This same adaptability offers hope as we face modern challenges. Just as Neolithic farmers learned to work with natural cycles rather than against them, we might find ways to live sustainably on our crowded planet. The story of agriculture's birth reminds us that humans can remake their entire way of life when circumstances demand it. The question facing us now is whether we have the wisdom to learn from both the successes and mistakes of those first farmers, and the courage to once again transform how we live on Earth.